Doctors with disabilities exist in small but measurable numbers. How did they navigate their journey? What were the challenges? What are the benefits to patients and to their peers? What can we learn from their experiences? My name is Lisa Meeks, and I'm thrilled to bring you the Docs with Disabilities podcast. Join me as I interview docs, nurses, psychologists, OTs, PTs, pharmacists, dentists, and the list goes on. I'll also be interviewing the researchers and policymakers that ensure medicine remains an equal opportunity profession.
Hello, and welcome back to the Docs with Disabilities podcast. Today we are joined by General Surgeon and Medical Technology Innovator, Dr. Christopher McCulloh. In this episode, Dr. Meeks and Dr. McCulloh discuss the importance of mentorship for disabled healthcare workers, how and when to disclose a disability, and the impact of disability representation in medical education. We begin with an introduction by Dr. Meeks.
Today's episode is really kind of special. When you think about it, it's really two old friends just sitting down, having a chat, and kind of reflecting actually on what's happened. A lot has happened over the last decade, and talking about where we need to go with disability inclusion. Where are the pinch points? And my guest today, I've known, we just figured out for about a decade, a little over a decade, and I'm going to let him introduce himself.
So my name is Chris McCulloh. I'm a surgeon. I'm a general surgeon. I became disabled actually when I was in the process of interviewing for medical school after I'd been accepted to a few places, but before I matriculated. And so I went through medical school and residency and fellowship training with a disability, spinal cord injury that requires the use of a wheelchair. And I completed residency in general surgery, in pediatric minimally invasive surgery, surgical critical care. And I am currently in the med tech industry working at a company developing artificial intelligence platforms for surgery. I was a non-traditional student, which is how I found my way to Case Western. I had a whole career in technology, consulting, and software engineering before I went to medical school. So my long-term career goal was always to combine technology and surgery. And this current opportunity was a right time, right place, right fit kind of opportunity that allowed me to really bring together all of those experiences and all of my expertise in those fields. So I'm super excited with where I am right now.
I love when people say, there's this guy, you should meet him.
Yeah.
And we've had so many talks about this topic. I mean, to the point of Lisa, stop talking. And you also were part of the AAMC project, the Lived Experience project. And that was so much fun. You had a relatively good experience at the good old Case Western Reserve. We love Case.
Mm-hmm.
Cases. I think you had a remarkably easy experience there. You really didn't need many accommodations, which I think is probably counterintuitive to what most people would think, right?
Yeah.
And, so I guess today we could really focus and center our conversation on what you've been doing since then, because you've done residency, fellowship. And it's been a long road. I think it's been a road where ableism has been present at times, sometimes more than others. I think for both of us, one of my biggest concerns at this point in my career, and when I look at the landscape, and I think you would probably agree, is what's happening in GME.
Mm-hmm.
And so I get really worried when this cohort of learners are leaving UME and matching into GME. Just going into that, I think, is probably a rude awakening versus what we're seeing in UME. And so maybe talk about your experience, having had a positive experience, and then going into the match. And we'll start there and see where we wind up.
Sure. I think at a lot of points along the way, I was very fortunate. I had a number of people who I connected really well with who were not only mentors but supporters and sponsors. And one of the first for me is Ed Barksdale, who's out in Cleveland, and he talks a lot about he's mentored I don't even know how many hundreds, if not thousands, of people, and he talks a lot about the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. Whereas mentorship is sort of guiding somebody along and giving them helping them to learn the ropes and sort of like figure out their own path, whereas sponsorship is actually personally investing in somebody and putting one's own sort of neck on the line to support somebody and really helping to make those connections and forge that path. He to me was a sponsor as more than just a mentor. I mean, he was both, but I had a number of people who were not only mentors but sponsors, and I think that's a really key role, especially for people who are disabled, because mentorship is great and it's wonderful to have people help you learn the next steps that need to be in the process. But unfortunately, the reality of things is people who are disabled entering your career in medical education, they need sponsorship. They need people who believe in them. They need people who can support them. The match process itself has the ability to allow discrimination to continue to occur because it is sort of a blinded process. And so that sponsorship was really key. And I was fortunate. I had that from the very beginning, and that was why I matched into a great residency that provided me phenomenal training and at a place where I was incredibly supported. And the sponsorship that I had there allowed me to obtain the next steps and to perform research at a big top tier children's hospital and to obtain fellowships at Ohio State and University of Michigan. They're two of the top academic institutions in the country, if not the world. I think at a very high level that sponsorship is key, in particular for people who are disabled.
Yeah, I do find that for people who have kind of institutional agents, people who sponsor them, right? And are essentially their
Yeah.
cheerleader, their navigator, their unwritten curriculum, decoder, all of that tend to do better. And it's almost like borrowing the trust and the political and social capital that the person in the institution already has to say, okay, I have vetted you, I know you, I think you're worthy. But of course, not everybody has that. I know you do such a good job. I'm so impressed. You answer a lot of emails from students who are wheelchair users and are like, I want to go to medical school. What do I do? And it's interesting for me as an outsider to kind of see the progression of people that have gone through this and and they all know one another because they've all exchanged these experiences through this network to support one another. That is very, very valuable. And so having those people that are in the institution and pushing for greater inclusion, yeah, that's really important.
And when I was applying for residency, one of the things that really stuck with me the most, because it really resonated with me, was people are going to respond to you one of three ways. One is, of course, oh, he's disabled, there's no way he can do this, and it's just going to be a very negative perception. The other, one of the other extreme, sort of the inverse, is that is, oh wow, look how far this guy's already gotten, and he's disabled. Like if he can get this far and accomplish this much, he can clearly do anything. And then the third way was, okay, well, he's disabled, but he got this far, so he can do the work. And for me, I want the people in the middle. I don't want the people who are like, oh, wow, you're so great. I want the people who said, okay, you can do the work. So what? You're going to be the same as any other resident. To me, that's what I want. I mean, everybody's different and everyone has different perceptions, but I want that. And I think a lot of people want to be just treated the same, like not, with kid gloves or special or anything like that. Like hold me to the same standards. When I'm in the operating room, I certainly don't, for myself and for my patients, I don't want to be held to different standards than any other surgeon, because that's not fair to the patients ultimately. There were different reactions that I got when looking at residency programs. One of them, which is ultimately where I ended up, was with Eric Lazar at Morristown Medical Center. And his view was, whatever you need, we'll get it done. Like if you tell me that the door to the bathroom isn't wide enough, I'll have people from facilities in there the next day knocking down the wall and putting in a bigger door. Like that was his approach, is like, whatever it takes, we'll get it done. It was very businesslike. I really appreciated it because he didn't shy away from the questions. And he had this sort of intuitive nature I've known him now for probably close to 10 years. And I don't know that he has an extensive history of anyone in his family or anything like that who's disabled, but his mentality was just well, there's logistical issues, but otherwise it's the same as anybody else. There's a story he'd love to tell of when I interviewed there as a medical student. One of the assistants was there and said, "Oh, well, should we help him? Should we help get him a plate for dinner?" And he kind of was like, if he can't feed himself dinner, then how is he going to perform surgery? That's, for me, that's the mentality that I wanted. So, it was a perfect fit for me. But again, to your point, there are a lot of people that had very different reactions. I know that there are places that I interviewed where I interviewed and the interview was great. It was a very enjoyable interview and everybody was very welcoming and warm and friendly. And then when it came time to the match, what I heard through people who had connections to the particular institutions was, "Oh, well, we don't think you can cut it as a surgeon." And in my mind, it's, well, one, if you don't think I can cut it, why did you interview me in the first place? Why did you ask me to spend the money associated with traveling? And this is 2012 that this all was occurring, and my time and away from school and everything else, because what amounts to, we basically wanted to meet you. And the unfortunate part is that happened for residency, and that happened again in fellowship. I know there are places where I interviewed and some of the faculty told me directly after, the first round of pediatric surgery interviews that your application was just so impressive, we just had to meet you, which, it's a pain for anyone to travel, especially to take time off during training, let alone traveling with a disability is even more of a pain in the butt than it is when you're able-bodied. So there's still a lot of that.
For individuals with disabilities, whether or not to disclose one's disability becomes a central question to any application process. This is especially true in the field of medicine. Listen in as Dr. Meeks and Dr. McCulloh talk about the barriers to disclosure.
One of the things that I'm curious about is when you went to these interviews, how did you prepare? Because that's something that students that are wheelchair users ask all the time. Do I bring it up? Do I wait for them to bring it up? It's an elephant in the room. How do I navigate letting them know that I am capable of all of these things without making the conversation awkward?
I think that decision has to be individualized for everybody. As someone who uses a wheelchair, it was very much like, well, it would be a little weird if I show up there and hadn't mentioned the topic beforehand. But I think that's because of the fact that my disability is visible. And I think there are a lot of people out there who have disabilities that are not visible, but still would affect their experience in residency. And I think the decision for them is harder. Now, the interesting thing about it is, I interviewed for all this stuff 10 years ago, long before COVID and virtual interviews. Now it's a different playing field. You're not legally required to disclose this stuff, and they're actually not legally allowed to ask you about disability and other things. So, but in my mind, at that time, that wasn't even an option because it was going to be an in-person interview and they were going to see the wheelchair, so I had to disclose it. I think it's a harder decision to make now. I do get students who reach out to me and ask, what do I do? Do I disclose? Do I tell them about XYZ condition? I think it does have to be an individualized decision. If it's something that is going to require accommodations that will affect the day to day, I think in my mind, the best way to approach it, at least for me, was to bring it up in my personal statement. Because the reason I did that is if I open the topic and bring it up, then the door is open and they can ask questions about it. And it's not a topic that they are feeling uncomfortable or that they're breaking any rules in bringing up. So if I've opened the door, they can walk right through it. For me, I wasn't going to try to address the issue myself as far as my capabilities. I was going to make sure that my letter writers could support me and address those issues. Validation coming from a third party is going to be worth a lot more than me saying, "Oh yeah, I can do it." When I applied, I had letters from 3 surgeons at Case Western, and they all said something to the effect of, yeah, I know what you're thinking, but he can do it. He's been at the operating table with me. I've seen him scrubbing on cases. I've seen him do things. So having that third-party validation is why I think I was successful in the process. And I think it's because of that support I had from the faculty there. I think having them address the disability for me is what worked. But I think for people who have disabilities that are not immediately visible, it's a more challenging question. And I think they have to balance what the impact of that disability is going to be on their residency experience with their feelings about disclosure. I think that's key for everybody. I think in my stubbornness, as you know, I was not completely honest with the impact that it would have on my residency experience. And even though I had a great experience and I think I was ultimately successful, and I'm a board certified surgeon, I think that it was a lot harder. And if I had been more honest with myself going into it, I think I could have made it easier on myself and on the people who supported me. I had to learn to be more upfront asking for help. I really had to learn to ask for things when I needed them, whether it was in the operating room and I needed to reposition the table or move around or do things. I came into things and I had this idea that I have to do things just the same as everybody else. And if I ask for help, it's going to put a focus on my disability and it's going to make it obvious that I'm disabled. Like, it's not obvious because I'm using a standing wheelchair in an operating room, which nobody else does, right? Like, so I would hesitate to ask to do things that would make the procedure easier for me to do because I didn't want to draw attention to my disability. Well, the end result was I would struggle to do things, which just put even more attention on my disability than if I just said, hey, can we move the table up, down, left, right, however. In my stubbornness to prove myself and not ask for help, I think I ultimately made things harder on me than if I had just said, hey, I need us to do this. And it would have been forgotten and moved on. So that was a hard lesson for me personally to learn. And that's going to be different for everybody going into this process.
It's funny. I interviewed Allison Kessler. She said the same thing. She said she tried for so long to just almost shrink herself, almost hide herself, and not ask for anything. And if she had to do it over again, she would have just asked for what she needed. It would have made life a million times easier for everybody involved. You spend so much time proving that you belong in medicine. This is just the hyper extension of that feeling that you have to constantly prove yourself. It's just another layer of that, of what I think is kind of the threshold for being in medicine writ large.
I think it absolutely is. And I think it's a very good point. I mean, everybody in medicine is so concerned with making sure that we fit in and that we're performing at the same level as all of our peers, because we think all of our peers are looking at us and, we think we're not living up to their level and their expectations and what they're accomplishing. Well, guess what? They're all thinking the same thing too, and they're too busy thinking about themselves to be worried about everybody else. So it's a whole field of people all worried about themselves and how everybody else perceives them when nobody has the time or energy to perceive other people. And I've heard this time and time again, able-bodied and disabled, it doesn't matter. Like, this is just a function of the medical training system in this country.
In our next section, Dr. Meeks and Dr. McCulloh discuss disability disclosure and how it may be received by people with and without lived experience.
The way that graduate medical education is set up, so often the experience that you have really hinges on one person, and that's the PD. I remember the Julia Cron and Lauren Mice episode, and that was just such a beautiful relationship where she had that experience as being a cancer survivor, and and was able to have this really authentic conversation with this applicant. But not everybody has that. And so when you're relying on one person to know what the right thing to do is, that's a lot of power. And we're not doing a good job training PDs about this part of diversity. I find myself these days validating the fear. I think it's important to say, yes, this is a possibility. It is a possibility that if you disclose that someone will have some biases against disability and you won't match.
If places have that opinion, that's not a place that I personally want to be. And I'd rather know ahead of time. And obviously, that's a different decision for everybody who goes through this. But I think in order to be successful, the best program is going to be a program that, does not shy away from disability, and a place that is willing to do what it takes to help people who are disabled be successful. And I think that's such a huge part of it. And I get the fear of disclosing, because you worry, if I disclose, then I'm potentially opening myself up to less opportunity. But again, if that opportunity isn't there because you're disabled, it wasn't really there in the first place. And it's better to know that ahead of time.
And it's better to situate yourself in the healthiest training environment you can, because training is not easy. It will task every part of you. And so being able to be authentic, ask for whatever support you need, I think is really important. I know our research shows that there are significant consequences to well-being when people disclose a disability but don't disclose it to their program. In other words, they'll say in an anonymous survey, yes, I am disabled, but they will not ask for accommodations. They will not tell their program. And then the other thing is, if you wind up in a performance issue situation, not meeting your milestones, whatever the case may be, there's no retroactive way to say, oh, well, I was disabled and I hadn't asked for accommodations, but if I had accommodations, I would have been
Right.
fine. Right.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. You can't really go back. Having that supportive faculty was huge. I mean, Dr. Lazar was supportive for me, but he was like that for everybody. He was the kind of person where a month or two into residency, everybody knew him and he knew everybody in the program. I would talk to people in other programs who, general surgery is a 5-year residency, and they would be in the elevator with their program director as a third year at the midpoint of that program. And the program director would kind of look at them and you kind of know who they were, but not really know them. That's impossible with where I trained. I mean, we knew Lazar. Lazar knew everybody. Like he was phenomenal. He is a model for what a person should be for running a program in any specialty. We knew we could call on him for anything. He treated all of us like we were his kids. That's the way that it should be. And disability or not, like I feel like, that those are the kind of people who should be running these programs, because it created a family atmosphere, but it made it easy to share your difficulties, and other people would chip in. And when other residents were having problems, there were times that Dr. Lazar would reach out to me and one of my other co-chiefs when we were chief residents, and he would say, hey, this other person a few years down from you is having trouble, see what you can do. And we would go hang out with the person and see them outside work and like help them to confront whatever challenges they were facing. That's the kind of environment everybody needs, disability or not. And I think it's particularly important for people who are disabled, but everybody benefits from that.
What I'm hearing from you is it was an environment where there was bidirectional trust, and also an expectation that if you needed help, you asked for it, and that it would be there without judgment, which is, I think, so important, especially when we have all of these initiatives to increase resiliency and increase wellness. But if you really ask for it, it's a different story.
It's absolutely true. We were in a place where if we needed something, we knew we could ask for it. It was an open door policy. We could walk into the office and he had couches and chairs and you could just plop down in them and say, hey, I had a terrible day. This is what happened. Or, hey, I made a mistake today. I screwed up. And if you did that and you were honest and told him the mistakes you made and what you did, you knew he had your back. everybody who's been through his training program recognizes how he is with people. So I think that, like I said, I think that goes for everybody, disabled or not.
Let's take a moment to switch gears as Dr. Meeks and Dr. McCulloh discuss the importance of disability representation in medicine and how it can be leveraged to combat ableism.
Let's shift the conversation. Medicine is ableist.
Yes, yeah.
We agree.
No, you'll hear no argument at all from me. It's terrible that we are in a profession where we're supposed to be taking care of people and helping them improve their health and live better lives. And not only is it ableist, but the profession as a whole does not encourage good health practices amongst its practitioners. To put it mildly.
My work is building on the shoulders of giants that came before me, right? At least the Lisa Iazonis, Christy Kirshner, Ray Curry, Tom Shakespeare. But this idea that infusing the physician workforce with people with disabilities normalizes disability, combats this perspective of disability being less than, out on social security disability, not productive, not happy, all of these, kind of belief systems. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the impact of you just being in the space. How powerful do you think that is in changing people's minds?
I think for a lot of people, it's huge. I think that just to see somebody, who's doing that is a game changer. It's not something they ever would have thought of. And I think that shifts, I hope that shifts people's perception of disability in general. Like you said, there's this perception that a lot of people, I think, have that if you're disabled, you are on disability, and SSI obviously can't have a job and can't do all these other things. And I think seeing people out there that are not only, surviving, but people who are thriving, I think it helps to change perceptions in general. While I know it affected the views of people that I went to medical school with and people that I encountered in training, and obviously many patients, to me, obviously, with an interest in pediatric surgery, the impact that I felt was the biggest was in kids seeing someone who was disabled, because one, it could change the perception of theirs for the rest of their life, which could then change the perception of other kids that they're growing up with. But in particular with kids who also were disabled, who saw somebody else as a successful member of society. I had opportunities to meet kids who were disabled, and they would see me and see, oh wow, this is, okay, so he can do this, so this is something that I can do. It's sort of like representation matters for everybody. But there were times that I had experiences, well, I didn't have them per se, but other people would see me. There were times that I would be in my standing chair and in the operating room scrubbing, and they would wheel a kid into the next OR, not one of my own patients, and there were times that the kids would just sort of like sit up and look and see me in the chair, and then the people who were with those kids would come to me afterwards and say, yeah, there's this girl who just was laser focused on you because she uses a wheelchair also, and they had left her chair back in the pre-op area. And so that impact to me is even more far reaching and even more significant. And I think people seeing someone who's disabled in these situations causes them to hopefully shift their perceptions of disability.
I can't imagine how powerful that must be for those children. What society constructs for them as possible is shattered the minute they see you. Like, if you think of our society kind of putting physicians up on a pedestal as the ultimate position, and within medicine, surgeons, I think for them, it just shatters that. In our talk that we did together, one of the slides, was children dressing up. And and how at Halloween, children that are wheelchair users are not dressing up as physicians or nurses or any type of medical professional. And so just even being able to feel that or think that, I think is incredibly powerful.
To your point, they've made jokes about this even in shows like Family Guy, where, one of the main characters, Joe, uses a wheelchair. And there's a scene in particular about Halloween where they're talking about who they're going to dress up with. And the whole point of the scene is basically people think someone who's in a wheelchair can only dress up as somebody who is obviously disabled. The scene just harps on, like, who are you going to be for Halloween? Are you going to be Professor X? Are you going to be and they just list off all these people in a wheelchair. And whereas Joe, who's the wheelchair user, is kind of like, no, I'm being a swimmer. He's like, it's like, and it's funny, and it's Family Guy, it's crass humor and all, which I love, but it makes the point of, like, yes, it is silly. Why should somebody who's in a wheelchair be limited to just these costumes at Halloween? Who cares? They can be whatever they want to be. I don't know if their point was to get very deep, but in culture and society, but it gets to that idea.
I don't know if you'll remember this, but I remember when you were in Columbus and we were having a chat one day and you were kind of laughing, but also kind of like, I think at some point you just get so tired that you will also blow some things off. Like we were talking before we started recording, but you were in the grocery store and there was this girl that was like falling all over herself to help you. I don't remember exactly what she said, but something about you being tired. And I think your response was something very Chris-like of, I am really tired. I've done 4 surgeries today and, so, yeah, help me get my groceries. I tell that story, as a way to kind of situate for people how ridiculous it is that there is this automatic kind of view of you and your ability in one setting, and then it's the complete opposite of what somebody would think.
Yeah, it is. And that still happens. I mean, that happens day in, day out. And I still have, like, usually I try to not be too snarky about my responses. I mean, people mean well, but it's sort of like, really? Yeah. I do tell the story of crossing over the bridge from the parking lot to the hospital, and someone tried to, oh, let me help you. And I was like, no, no, I don't need help. I'm fine. And he said, no, 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 let me help you. And I was like, no, really, I'm fine. And the person then went ahead and he grabbed the wheelchair. And I literally just grabbed the wheels and locked them in my hands and looked at him like, and obviously like offended and annoyed kind of face, like, no, I'm fine. And it was a very like stern, go away kind of face. Less than a week later, I walk into my next rotation, and that was my attending. But fortunately, he said, I just want to tell you that experience made me think. He said, I realized that I was forcing my views on somebody else, and that was not right. And so the end result was actually good, even though it was like I was quite angry. Yes.
Yeah, you were mad. That's your body. That's like an extension of, you wouldn't go up to somebody and touch their shoulder and say, come along, let's
Right.
go.
Yep. You wouldn't pick them up and say, like, here, let me help you up this ramp.
We have identified many ableist aspects of our medical education system. Now it's time for Dr. Meeks and Dr. McCulloh to discuss the changes needed in medical training to reduce the bias against disabled individuals.
Just curious, now that you've gone through training and you've done all of this, is there one or maybe 2 things that you can pinpoint throughout your training, doesn't matter if it's the UME or GME level, that you say, if that changed, it would be a game changer for people, disabled people across the board?
There's a lot of things that I feel like should change. I think that the reason that I had such a good experience, it was my program director. And I think having a program director who is personally invested in all of their trainees, and each of their, obviously, he often liked to tell people when they would ask about training someone who's disabled, he would say, look, everybody has issues, everybody has challenges that they face. His are just a lot more obvious than somebody else. And I think that's the approach that people need, is that everybody's going through life and through training with a unique set of challenges. And all of those challenges have to be respected. And we're all better if we work together on helping each other to function and thrive with all of those things. And I think if there were people like that throughout training and throughout the medical field, I think the training experience would be better for everybody. And I think that as a result, medical care would be better. We could identify with our patients better. It would just foster a much better culture. And I think that gets to a bigger picture, or a bigger, challenge, which is just the caustic nature of medical education in this country. I think this is something that needs to be changed for everybody. I think the system as it is broken, and it breaks people. And I think it's a bigger conversation, but we need to change how the system works.
You've used the term disabled several times. I'm curious, when you say the word disabled in your community, so in training, with your peers, things of that nature, do you get pushback?
I don't. And I try to, if anything, teach the people around me that it's not a dirty word. I've had people say, well, what words do I use? What's the right terminology? And I would tell them, well, ask the person you're talking to, because everybody's different. But disabled is not a dirty word. It's a term that can encompass, and does encompass, a broad variety of experiences that different people have, depending upon what their medical issues and challenges are. And I say medical, including mental health in that, because I think mental health is a huge component of that we don't take seriously enough, and that is not given enough energy and concern, especially in healthcare. There's such a huge stigma against disability in general, but against mental health in particular. We touched a little bit on this notion of discrimination and the application process for residency and fellowship. This process, unfortunately, is one that does allow for discrimination. The way the process works, and it's a standardized application that goes out to residency and fellowship programs, they decide who they want to interview. They interview people, and then there's this big national algorithm, which people refer to as the match. And the applicants submit their list of programs at which they interviewed, and it's a ranked list of places that they'd like to go. And the programs submit a list of applicants that they interviewed that they would like to come to their program, and it's also a ranked list. And then this big algorithm goes up and matches everybody up. And the idea is it favors the applicants, and it puts the most people into spots that it possibly can. But the problem, of course, is that whereas when you're applying to a job in the traditional sense, it's easier to make a case for discrimination. That's not something that can be done given the current matching system. And I think this system, unfortunately, the way it's designed, enables the ability to discriminate against applicants for whatever reason. And people say, oh, no, the algorithm is not biased. And that's true. The algorithm is not biased. But if you give it biased input, you're going to get a biased result from it. There was a big news story about a year and a half, 2 years ago, about a major academic institution. And it was found out that they had the system that would assign criteria to different applicants. And that system, based on how it was designed, was ranking Black applicants lower because of schools that they had gone to, HBCUs. The end result was that it was actually a discriminatory process, even though it was going through this supposedly blinded process. That's probably the most notable example of it. But this kind of discrimination happens day in, day out with many institutions. And I don't say that to scare people who are applying or to scare people away from disclosing, but it's a problem that we need to talk about, and it's a problem that needs to be fixed. I don't have an answer for how to fix that, but the current process, unfortunately, allows for discrimination, and there is no recourse for people who are, on the unfortunate side of that process. It gets to the bigger issue that we're trying to talk about here, which is how do we enable and make sure that people who are disabled are successful in all fields of medicine? Well, part of it starts with that pathway into medicine and into various specialties. And I think that's something that needs to be talked about more.
Well, certainly garbage in, garbage out, right? People say, well, it's the system. And I'm like, but who runs the system? People run the system. So, yes, we want to look at things at a systems level, but we also have to recognize that this is driven by individual people and their biases. So, we have to, at the same time, address the biases, make people aware of them, and work to have them learn to cognitively correct and just educate more. I mean, I think just even telling the story of you or the countless other people that are in our network is a way of myth busting. I think the laws that are designed to protect people with disabilities so often actually work against them, because one of the things that I hear from program directors, so when I'm hearing it from the other side, is I can't ask any questions, so I don't know. And the things that I want to know the answers to that might make a difference, I can't ask.
Yep. Yeah. That's absolutely true, which is why I try to open the door. That's why I try to put it out there. And because I think that there are people who want to ask those questions. And as an applicant, I felt if people didn't ask those questions, it was disingenuous. It was that they weren't really serious about me. Because I think those are logistical questions that have to be answered. And if you're not asking them, it means that you're not taking me seriously.
There's got to be some sort of kind of happy medium. I try to tell applicants to triangulate everything, right? So the MSPE, the dean's letter, the letters of recommendation, and your personal statement should all tell the same story. And then if you're going into a procedural specialty, look at the procedures that are required for board certification and think about how you would approach these, or go in your sim lab, work with one of your faculty members to actually try, so that somebody can say in a letter, look, we've gone through all the internal medicine procedures with this person. We know that they're capable of doing it. Obviously, efficacy is going to increase over time, but they're capable physically of doing it. And I think that goes a long way, as you said earlier.
It does. And that's something I think that that I think everybody should be doing that, but in particular, people who, have more challenges than others. Yeah.
I do want to give you the chance to answer kind of our grounding question, right? Which is, the whole idea of this podcast came about because you were answering a million emails, I'm answering like everybody's trying to answer the emails. We cannot possibly provide all the mentorship to all of the potential applicants because there's just so few people in this space right now, and many more coming, which is great. But I thought, well, what if we did a podcast and told stories and challenges, and how did we work around that? One, it would provide a space and platform for the myth busting. And then two, those people that are in the pathway that want to come to medicine, or that are medical students or looking at going into residency, will have a place to go and listen to stories about how other people did it. Where were the pinch points? What needs to be done? And so the floor is yours, my friend. What advice would you give to whatever stakeholder, or all of them, about being disabled in medicine?
No, that's all. It's a small question, right? I think the most important aspect of it for both the institutions and the system, as well as for the individual, is open and honest communication is the key to everybody's success. And I say this because of my own experience, not anybody else's, and that's being honest with oneself about one's needs, and then also communicating those needs and having an open channel of communication is the key to people being successful. And I think that goes for, disabled and able-bodied alike, but I think it's particularly important for students or applicants who are disabled. It's more important for them because they have very different needs and the people who are on the other side of that, who may be very well intentioned and want to do the best thing, they don't know what to do in those situations. They're only going to be able to facilitate somebody's success if they know what that person needs. And so I think that finding a school, a residency program, a fellowship programs, and ultimately a practice where those conversations are easy and they are supportive, that is the key. That's the key for everybody. I learned this myself as somebody who uses a wheelchair getting in, trying to move through surgery. There are not a lot of people who've done it before me. There are people who've done it before me. I'm certainly not the first, but there are not so many that everybody knows how to do it. And we're all learning together. And as long as those communication channels are open, then people can be successful. The breakdowns that I've seen are when one or both sides are not willing to have that open discussion. And I think that's the key.
I couldn't agree more. I'm so grateful for you.
You too. I'm glad we've been friends for as long as we have.
You've been instrumental in this work and helping me kind of navigate it. And I'm so appreciative. And I'm so grateful you came on today. And I think I'm going to get a superpower group together for a panel where we can just really talk about the deep ableism that's tethered to the racism, that's tethered to all sorts of things that, really hold medicine back from being just a great place to thrive for people who are historically kind of minoritized and marginalized. So
that would be awesome.
It would be.
I would be quite look forward to that. So.
Well, thank you so much, my friend, and have a beautiful Saturday. It's gorgeous here in Cleveland, Ohio.
Yep, it's gorgeous here in Boston too. So,
and listen to this podcast.
Thank you very much, Lisa. It's great to do it.
Thanks, Chris.
Yep.
Thank you to our guest, Dr. McCulloh, for sharing your wisdom and expertise with us today. We are so grateful for your insight on mentorship and disability disclosure. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We hope you subscribe to our podcast and tune in next time. This podcast is a production of the Docs with Disabilities Initiative and is supported in part by the University of Michigan Medical School Department of Family Medicine M-Disability Initiative, the Stanford Medicine Alliance for Disability Inclusion and Equity, and the Ford Foundation. The opinions on this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the hosts, their respective institutions, or the funders. This podcast is released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, Non-Derivative License. This episode was produced by Lisa Meeks and Gabe Abrams with support from our audio editor, Jacob Feeman.